Hi, I'm Laura Grossenbacher, the director of the Technical Communication Program here in the College of Engineering. We're housed in the Engineering Centers building. And you probably know us best from some of the required courses for engineering students, EPD 155, Basic Communication, and EPD 397, Technical Communication. It grieves me that I'm here to talk to you about plagiarism because our program does a lot more than talk about plagiarism or hunt for plagiarism. We're not the plagiarism police. And so if I'm lucky, I'll get to talk to you someday about technical writing issues, but I am here to talk to you about plagiarism and how to avoid it in the writing that you do for your courses. So I'm hoping that you've downloaded a document in PDF form that it's kind of a curious document. The first page you'll see just says memo, and it's from EPD 497, the plagiarism group, it says. And it's to the EPD 397 faculty. I just want to explain a little bit about what this document is that you'll be looking at. It's an overview of some issues with plagiarism. So I'll explain why my students created that document. Then I'll briefly describe some of the terms that are defined in it, summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. I'll justify why we paraphrase and summarize more in engineering writing than we do quotes. And then I'll give some special emphasis to general and field-specific common knowledge. You'll have heard of this term common knowledge, but there are some flavors of it that you should know about. I do have a few examples of those. And then we'll look briefly back at a few examples in this handout. And I will talk a bit then about some cultural concerns that are fairly tricky, and I'll wrap up with the big mistake that I see a lot of engineering students making. It's not intentional plagiarism, it's unintentional, but I'll try to give you some pointers about how to avoid that. And then I do have some other sources that you can look at on plagiarism that are kind of interesting and actually humorous, so you might like those. So to go back to what I was starting with, this handout is a memo directed to the 397 faculty, and it was written by a group of students in my technical editing class, which is EPD 497, some years ago now. It's 1999 is when it was dated. They wrote this because that editing class took as its charge to edit some 397 reports that were written and by various students the semester before. They were submitted by instructors who said, these are A papers, we think these are great. We hope that the 497 class will edit them further and then put them online in an online journal that the undergraduate students were creating at that time. So we expected that these were going to be great reports, and what happened is that I just, as a matter of course, said, you know, I should have one particular group from this class just be sure that we don't have any kind of plagiarism in these reports. I didn't expect that there would be any kind of plagiarism, but as it turned out, they found plagiarism in every report that was submitted, and they were all A papers. So my students were very disgruntled by this. They were all pretty good writers themselves, and they felt like you should never copy, and they were angry that these people got through the system with A's, even though some of it was what they considered rampant plagiarism. So they wrote up this document. First, they have a note here explaining how this whole situation that I just explained to you, and then they say, we think that the reason why plagiarism is happening so much in 397 is that the documents that are available on plagiarism at the UW Writing Center are too lengthy, and a lot of students just ignore these. And so I look at their document that they put together, and I realized, oh, it's just about as long as the one from the UW Writing Center. So they're not really saving us a whole lot of time, unfortunately, in what they put together here. But what they did do is that they condensed a lot of the basic rules in the second page that you look at here. Just says avoid plagiarism at the top, and they've got some brief definitions here and some explanation of common knowledge. And so I think they assumed that that one page would be enough for you to read and you'd know enough to avoid anything that might be considered plagiarism. And then the reason why their document gets very lengthy is they included some examples from the papers that they were looking at. These were A papers, but they had really some egregious examples of plagiarism, so they wanted students to see those real examples. So if we look at the second page, avoid plagiarism, and just look at some of the points that they made here, First, they talk a little bit about why it's important to cite sources, why you would even use sources to begin with, and why you want to cite them. They talk about things like, well, there's 3 important reasons to document sources. To show you have support for the claims that you're making. It helps you to construct and preserve your own credibility. Now, I hope that if you've been in 155 and 397, our writing courses here in the College of Engineering, you've heard some of our instructors talk about credibility quite a bit. And you know that that matters, and the way to build your own credibility is to show that you are reading credible sources. So you want to have that out there to build credibility. You also put it in there to allow others to find out more information on your topic. And if people want to check your sources to determine how credible are your sources, you know, if they find a claim you're making questionable in some way, they're going to look at your source and say, well, is that source a moneyed interest? Is that a source that maybe has a particular bias about this issue because they have money to gain? So people might look into those things to determine issues about credibility. So we need to know what the sources are. And there are 3 different things that you will use. You can use summaries of a source, and that is to take a big, lengthy article length, you know, let's say it's 40 pages, and just you condense it down and put it in your own words. Now, you don't have to put quotation marks there, but you do have to say this comes from X source, whatever it is. So there, no quotation marks, but you do have to document the source. So you do have to put in that documentation, and depending on what your instructor asks you to do, you would use maybe APA style, maybe Chicago Manual style, maybe IEEE style. A lot of instructors will be very specific about what style they want you to use when you're documenting sources. You just have to ask them if they don't tell you. And then you just be consistent. If you're using IEEE, use it all the way through. So you might put a number where a source is, and then your references page will be numbered. But at any rate, if it's a summary, you're condensing, and then you're documenting the source. A paraphrase is similar to a summary, except that it's not condensing a big, lengthy document. It's taking maybe just a few sentences or a short paragraph and putting that idea in your own words. And the trick with paraphrasing is that you look at the language and you try to cast it in your own words as much as you can. And you can't just go in and say, oh, I'll change a word here, and I'll change a word like 6 words later, and then maybe one that's 5 words later. You can't just pick and choose a few spots and make it look a little bit more like it's yours. You really do have to change the language and the structure of that passage substantially, and really do cast it in your own language so that you won't be accused of plagiarism. Now, even when you do put it in your own words, you still have to cite the source. So you'll say something like, as Smith argues, and then you go on and put in the Smith argues blah, 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 blah. You would still put the documentation at the end so they could go to the right page to find that information. Let's say, though, that the language that is used is there's something very remarkable about the language. There's specific terminology, there are statistics, there's let's say, an opinion that's used that's a remarkable opinion, or just a very unusual idea. You may look at the language and say, that is so well written, I want to quote it. Now, you can do that. You just put quotation marks around it, you still cite the source, and that's fine. I think the problem that students get into, especially in engineering writing, is that we don't do a lot of quotations. We don't riddle our papers with quotations, not nearly as much as you might have done if you were in an English course in high school where you were examining Hamlet and the words that were used were very, very important to analyze carefully. Usually language in engineering documents is not something that is specifically it's so perfect that it really can't be cast in another language. We prefer to see people going in and reading these documents and trying to put it in their own words, in part because the language isn't that spectacular, but secondly because we think that people really show a great knowledge of an issue or a topic if they've been able to put it in their own words. Anytime you've tried to do this, if it's been really hard for you, the reason it's hard is because you really need to know that topic well to be able to put it in your own words, and that's why teachers like to see you paraphrase, but you still have to say that this is from a source somewhere if you're getting that idea from a particular source. So There's some tricky things, though, that pop up for engineering writing, and it comes up in when we start talking about, well, are there certain terms that you don't need to quote or you don't need to cite at all? And that is common knowledge. And so I want to just quickly go over with you what common knowledge is. We talk about common knowledge, general common knowledge. And an example of general common knowledge might be something like, the World Trade Center towers were destroyed on September 11, 2001. Most of us can agree with the date that this occurred, and it's really just factual information. So something that would be seen in a lot of different documents, if it's a fact, usually you don't put quotation marks around that, and you don't even cite it. It's just general common knowledge. There's an idea called field-specific common knowledge, though, where let's say you've got an idea that's specific to civil engineering. There, you might be talking about some of the reasons why the World Trade Center's towers fell. And you might talk about how the heat from the burning jet fuel rose to such high temperatures that the steel skeleton of the building was weakened, and a few floors started to give way. And then as those floors gave way, the weight from their collapse pushed down on the next floor and created this condition called progressive collapse. Now, we all know what progressive collapse is now, I think, because we've heard about it a lot since the World Trade Center towers collapsed. But when it was first talked about, it was fairly specific to structural engineering. And so progressive collapse is a term that maybe the first time it was used, you could have put quotes around it and said, this is known as progressive collapse. Now it's become such a common part of a lot of people's vocabulary that you wouldn't even have to put quotation marks around it. But here's what's tricky for folks. If there's a chance that there are people in your audience that don't consider that common knowledge, or it may be so specific to a field that they've never heard about it before, like maybe it's an axial flow blood pump, then you might need to go ahead and put some quotes around it and say, Dr. Hiroshi first called this axial flow blood pump. So you might refer to it first, cite it somehow, put some quotation marks on it, and then after that in your document you don't have to put it in quotes every time, because it's something that you've taught people is a common term for something. So the odd thing about paraphrasing, and this is what gets a lot of students in trouble with plagiarism, is that there are so many terms in engineering that are very specific to certain fields, and engineering students don't know, how much can I expect you to know about this? How much do I expect that you know what lift-induced drag is, for example? If you have any doubts that your audience doesn't have the background to know that that's a common term in the field, then you just put it in quotes when you have some doubts. If you're talking about any kind of opinion having to do with progressive collapse, again, that's a good thing to quote or cite, put it in your own words and cite it. So if you ever had any doubt about a term or an idea and you're not sure whether to cite it or not, I would say, when in doubt, be careful and go ahead and cite it. Some other issues now that I wanted to get to with plagiarism, the examples that are in the handout that you have, if you page through some of these, you'll see the exact examples that were taken out of some of these 397 reports, and you'll see that they've given us a passage from the source, and then the plagiarized passage, and then a suggested rewrite. And I would just note that even in the plagiarized and the suggested rewrite, you'll see terms like uniform corrosion or galvanic corrosion, and those are terms that are specific to a field. They wouldn't need to be quoted in and of themselves. What we're concerned about is maybe when you have uniform corrosion is an attack of the metal. The whole phrase is exactly like what the author wrote. When you have a whole string of language and maybe mixed in with opinion or ideas or whatever, and it's taken straight from a source, then you're going to be finding yourself in trouble. Because it's very easy now for people to just go online and type in a line that if a professor suspects that you might be plagiarizing, you can actually just go into Google a lot of times now and type in that line, and it'll show you where the line comes from. It's very easy to search that way. There are also search engines called Turnitin that people can turn in your document and see, has this been published elsewhere? So my advice to you is simply do what you can to put things in your own words. When in doubt, put in a citation. There are some cultural concerns that I want to talk about really quickly. We have talked to many students who've come over here, they're English as second language students from Asia, and they say in our culture it's considered a measure of respect and a measure of high competency to have exactly memorized the language of a source and to be able to reproduce it as exactly as you can. And so why can't we copy all of this and put it into our paper without citing it? That's something that we have done back at home. And there are different takes on all of this, and I'm not sure that I believe that story fully, because I've talked to a few Asian students who said, yeah, but you still have to cite your source when you do that. It's still a measure of respect to say, this was so-and-so's idea. So I guess I should I want to go out as a warning here that there are teachers out there who worry that Asian students plagiarize more. I've actually found that that's not the case. In my own experience, there are many more examples of native English speakers who are doing the plagiarism thing, and I think it happens primarily because people are trying to move very quickly, and they don't intend to do it. And so let me just give you a warning about what I think engineering students end up doing that gets them in trouble. If you're rushing to get a document done, I've talked to a lot of students who say to me, oh yeah, I know I'm supposed to put in sources, I'm supposed to cite them, I'm going to go back in and put them in later. My advice is not to write like that way. If you're using sources in a paper, you need to let yourself know, put quotation marks around anything that you're pulling straight from a source. And if you're putting it in your own words, make a note to yourself too. This is all my own language. I paraphrased this. But then put the source right next to it, because you don't want to have the problem where it's late at night, the paper's due the next day, and you're going in and putting in the sources at the last minute. You can get mixed up that way. You can forget that this is straight from a source. Or you can actually get your sources scrambled, and then that sends up a red flag too. If a teacher feels like, wait a minute, I just found that they said this source came from this and it really came from this completely different thing, then they're going to get suspicious and start looking more carefully at all the citations, and pretty soon you might find that they've found something that really should have been cited and it wasn't, and you'll end up in a very uncomfortable discussion. So I hope that the folks that have listened to this will know, okay, we don't want to end up ever sitting down with a teacher and having them say, I think this is plagiarism, and then ending up trying to explain that. I've had a lot of students who come into me and said, I just didn't know what plagiarism really was. I thought that I could use a few of the words from the source, and as long as I changed one word here or there, it was going to be okay. And it's not okay. You actually have to use as much as you can, put it in your own words if you're paraphrasing. If you're not going to put it in your own words, you have to put quotation marks around it. A couple of places you could go for extra information on plagiarism. There is a nice site at the UW Writing Center that has a lengthy discussion of all of the things that I think that I've just discussed. They're not directing it particularly at engineering writing. I don't know that the people who wrote that really thought much about engineers and the conditions that you might be in here. So that's one place to go, but maybe not a definitive source. There's some kind of fun sources. You could look at, if you just Googled a guy named Sherman Dorn, D-O-R-N, has a site on plagiarism at the University of South Florida. And it's kind of a nice little site. Let me see if I can pull this up for you just a minute. It's a nice site where he talks about all of the different reasons that students have given him for why their document turned out to have some chunks in it that were straight out of a source. And it's sort of your typical excuse, and it's kind of fun to read, maybe, I guess, if you're an instructor more than as a student, because you see that, wow, these are all the all of the excuses that you hear all the time from students. If you're a savvy student, you'll look at this and know, yeah, those aren't very good excuses. I really don't have any excuse for plagiarism. So that's kind of a fun site in some weird way. And then there's even a more fun thing at Rutgers University. Their library, their Paul Robeson library, put together a fun little sort of talking head thing with an ancient-looking English teacher type on a bobblehead talking about plagiarism. But at some point they have this fun little game show called The Cite is Right. And you can actually play the game show yourself. You go through it, and it'll show you, here's a sentence. Is it a sentence that needs to be cited or not? And so you can sort of test yourself to see, do I know when I should be citing and when I don't have to cite? And it's kind of funny. And they even have a really bad little song about plagiarism at that site that's kind of fun to listen to. So that's all I have on plagiarism. I hope that I've helped some. Again, I don't see our program as a plagiarism police, but I do think that it's possible that plagiarism is common in engineering writing because people have to rush so often and they have so many responsibilities, and it can become something that you do not intentionally, by mistake, as you're rushing to get a lot of documents together. So I hope you can do the best you can to avoid it, and if you ever have any trouble, you can always come and talk to me about it. Thank you.